person responsible for Nancy Guthrie's abduction and possible homicide, and I don't want to go there yet. We don't know for sure what happened to Nancy, but he believes it is likely someone who knew her in some way, whether that be someone who worked in her house at one point, someone she knew from going to the grocery store. I mean, could be literally anyone in that capacity, but someone who knew her based on the statistics. And he's going to go through several different statistics and research methods that he has to try to narrow down who this person is responsible for Nancy Guthrie's disappearance.
Brian Entin has covered some of the darkest stories in modern American crime. He has stood outside courthouses while verdicts were read. He has knocked on doors in neighborhoods still raw with grief. He has looked into cameras and delivered the kind of news that stops people mid-sentence. Over the years, he built a reputation not just for being present at the center of major cases, but for asking the questions that other people were afraid to ask out loud. He didn't chase sensationalism. He chased truth. And that instinct, that willingness to sit with a case long after the initial headlines faded, is exactly what led him here. When the name Nancy Guthrie first began circulating, it didn't arrive with the kind of noise that usually surrounds a high-profile disappearance. There was no explosive breaking news moment, no single image that immediately captured the public's attention in the way some cases do. It started quietly, the way most tragedies in small communities begin, with a neighbor noticing something off, with a phone call that didn't get answered, with a door that should have opened and didn't. But Brian Entin noticed, and once he started looking, he couldn't stop. If you're watching this for the first time, and you haven't heard the name Nancy Guthrie before, you are about to understand why this case has continued to disturb everyone who has looked closely at it. And if you've been following along since the beginning, what comes next is going to add layers to what you already thought you understood. Before we go any further, if you believe that every victim deserves a voice and every story deserves to be told with honesty and care, consider subscribing to Keith's Crime Files and giving this video a like. It helps this channel continue doing exactly that. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She lived in Horseshoe Bay, Texas, a small, quiet lakeside community nestled in the Texas Hill Country, the kind of place where people retire to find peace, where the streets are calm, where the biggest concern on most days is the weather on the lake. Horseshoe Bay is not the kind of community that makes national crime headlines. It is not the kind of place where people feel the need to double-check their locks before bed or wonder about the safety of their neighbors. It is, by almost every measure, the definition of ordinary and uneventful. And Nancy herself fit that description perfectly. She was a widow, living alone. Her life moved along predictable rhythms, the routines that tend to define the daily structure of someone in their 80s, the small habits that become anchors. There was nothing about her that suggested conflict. No known enemies, no public disputes, nothing that anyone around her could point to as a warning sign. She was not the kind of person you would expect to find at the center of a violent crime. She was exactly the kind of person that tragedies like this are never supposed to touch. That's what made what happened so deeply unsettling from the very beginning. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Horseshoe Bay home in February of 2026. She did not leave a note. She did not tell anyone she was going somewhere. There were no packed bags, no phone calls to family or friends suggesting she had plans. She was simply there, and then she wasn't. When the people who cared about her realized something was wrong, when law enforcement responded and began to assess the situation, what they found inside that home began to raise questions that a straightforward explanation could not answer. The house did not look like the scene of a typical break-in. There was no evidence of the kind of frantic searching that characterizes a robbery. No drawers pulled open. No valuables obviously disturbed or removed. No clear sign that someone had entered looking for something they could take and sell. The chaos you would expect from an opportunistic intruder simply wasn't there, and that absence told its own story. Because a scene that should have been messy was instead strangely still. A home that should have carried the fingerprints of desperation carried something else instead, something that looked far more like control. Brian Entin began asking questions almost immediately. He spoke to people connected to the case. He listened to early theories from those familiar with the investigation. And from the very beginning, he felt what he would later describe as a specific kind of unease. The feeling that comes not from too little information, but from information that doesn't quite line up. He had worked enough cases to know what that feeling meant. It meant something was being missed. It meant the surface explanation wasn't the real one. One of the most significant pieces of evidence to emerge early in the investigation was surveillance footage captured on camera in the early morning hours around the time Nancy disappeared. The footage showed a male figure moving through the property, and the moment investigators and those close to the case began to study that footage carefully, a single detail stood out above everything else. The man was calm, not the kind of calm that comes from confidence in an unfamiliar situation, not the composed facade of someone trying to hold themselves together under pressure. This was something different, a deliberate, unhurried quality to every movement that suggested the environment around him was not new. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. He didn't pause to orient himself. He moved the way a person moves through a space they already know, through a layout they have already processed, through a setting that holds no surprises for them. Brian Entin watched that footage and felt the same thing many others felt when they saw it for the first time. This was not someone improvising. This was not someone reacting to circumstances in real time. Every step carried intention. Every movement had already been decided somewhere before that moment ever arrived. And that raised a question that would define the entire direction of the investigation going forward. How does someone move like that, unless they already know where they are going? The early theories that circulated were the ones you might expect. The first was robbery. It is statistically one of the most common reasons someone enters a home without permission. Financial motivation. The belief that something valuable can be taken quickly and converted into cash. It's a crime of opportunity, and it happens with regularity across the country. On the surface, it seemed like the natural starting point, but it fell apart almost immediately. Nothing was taken. The behavior on camera didn't reflect someone focused on finding valuables. There was no urgency, no sign of someone scanning rooms for items worth grabbing. The theory didn't survive contact with the evidence. Then came the idea of a random act, the possibility that this was simply one of those rare, terrifying instances where someone chooses a target by chance, where location and timing converge in the worst possible way, and an innocent person becomes a victim for no reason beyond proximity. That explanation exists because it does happen, but it carries its own signature. Random crimes tend to be disorganized. They carry the energy of improvisation, of someone adjusting in real time, of decisions made in the moment without a map to follow. That's not what the footage showed. What the footage showed was the opposite of improvisation. Brian sat with both theories, turned them over, looked at them from every angle, and arrived at the same conclusion each time. Neither one fit. Neither one explained the combination of calm behavior, deliberate movement, and the complete absence of any obvious motive visible within the scene itself. So he made a decision. Instead of continuing to work through explanations that didn't hold together, he reached out to someone whose entire professional life had been devoted to understanding not just what violent offenders do, but why they do it. Dr. Gary Braccato is a forensic psychologist and clinical researcher whose work has been grounded in the rigorous data-based study of violent behavior. His approach doesn't begin with assumptions or dramatic theories. It begins with patterns, the statistical realities of how crimes unfold, how offenders behave, what the numbers actually show when you strip away the noise. He has spent years studying the psychology of violence in ways that go beyond surface-level observation, looking not just at what people do, but at the thinking that precedes the action. When Dr. Braccato examined the Nancy Guthrie case, he started where he always starts, not with who might be responsible, with why. Because, as he explained to Brian Entin, once you understand the motive, everything else begins to come into focus. The how emerges from the why, not the other way around. And in a case with this many confusing signals, starting with motive was the only approach that had any real chance of cutting through the confusion. He broke the possibilities down into categories, based on documented crime patterns and real-world data. The first category he examined was sexual motivation. It is, statistically, one of the primary drivers behind home invasions involving a stranger and a victim living alone. But Dr. Brucato was quick to address the specific problem with applying that framework here. Crimes driven by sexual motivation follow recognizable patterns. The individuals who commit them tend to target a particular profile, and they tend to repeat the behavior across multiple incidents. They leave behavioral signatures that investigators have documented extensively across decades of case study. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the profile of the victim, an 84-year-old woman living alone, did not match the statistical profile for that type of crime. Not impossible, but so far outside the expected range that treating it as the primary explanation would have been statistically irresponsible. Dr. Brucato set it aside. The second category was robbery. It remained on the table longer than the first, simply because financial motivation is so common. People break into homes every day looking for money, electronics, jewelry, anything that can be turned around quickly for cash. The math makes sense on paper. But again, the evidence refused to cooperate. Nothing had been taken, and beyond that specific detail, the behavior on camera simply didn't align with someone operating out of financial desperation. Robbery creates urgency. The longer someone stays in a home without authorization, the greater their risk. People motivated purely by financial gain want to get in, get what they came for, and get out before anything goes wrong. The man on that surveillance footage didn't appear to be in any particular hurry to leave. He didn't move with the compressed, focused energy of someone under a time constraint. If anything, he moved as though time was not a concern at all. That detail mattered enormously, and it led Dr. Brucato to the third possibility, one that was harder to consider but that the evidence pointed toward more directly than anything else. Abduction. Not random, not impulsive, but deliberate and intentional. Someone entering the home with a specific goal, to take Nancy alive, to remove her from that location, and to use her as a form of leverage. It would explain the absence of stolen items. It would explain the deliberate pace of the suspect's movements. It would explain the level of control visible in the footage. If the objective was to take a person rather than a thing, then none of the behaviors that seemed strange in a robbery context would be strange at all. They would make perfect sense. But even that theory carried a significant problem. Real abductions conducted for financial leverage follow a documented pattern. Within the first 24 to 48 hours, there is almost always some form of communication, a demand, a message, something that establishes the terms of what the perpetrator wants and what they are willing to do. The person committing the crime needs to convert their leverage into something tangible as quickly as possible, because every hour that passes without contact is another hour for law enforcement to close the distance. Communication is not optional in that scenario. It is the entire point. But in Nancy Guthrie's case, that communication didn't materialize in any clear, structured way. The expected pattern was absent, and that absence was not a small detail to be explained away. It was a central contradiction that demanded an explanation of its own. Dr. Brucato offered one. When a crime begins with a clear objective and then loses its structure, when the expected sequence of events simply stops, it usually means that the objective was interrupted. Something happened that the people involved did not anticipate. Something went wrong during execution that forced a change of direction, a moment of crisis that the original plan had no answer for. For Brian Entin, that possibility opened a door he hadn't fully pushed through yet. If the intention had been to take Nancy alive, to hold her, to use her, then she would have been treated with a specific kind of care, not out of any compassion, but out of pure practicality. She would have been the most critical element of the entire operation. Her condition, her ability to be presented as alive, would have been the only thing that gave the entire plan any value. Damaging her in any serious way would have destroyed the leverage entirely. But Dr. Brucato pointed to something that made that picture complicated. The evidence, subtle as it was in places, suggested that things had not gone carefully. There were indicators, not dramatically visible, but present enough to matter, that the situation inside that home had not remained under the kind of controlled management the suspect's early movements had projected. And when something goes wrong in that type of high-stakes situation, the people involved are forced into rapid decision-making. They are pushed off their plan and into territory they didn't prepare for. That's where everything tends to get worse, because once the original goal becomes unachievable, the entire calculation changes. Nancy would no longer represent a source of leverage. She would represent something else entirely. A complication, a witness, a person who had seen and heard things that could not be allowed to surface. And in that transition, the most dangerous decisions of the entire event would have been made, not the ones that were planned, the ones that weren't. Brian Entin didn't need that spelled out for him in detail. He had been around enough cases to understand what that trajectory meant and where it most often led. But even accepting that framework, there was still a piece that refused to fit neatly into the picture. The reward. A reward of more than $1 million was offered for information that could lead to Nancy's recovery or to the identification of those responsible. $1 million is not a number that people set aside easily. It is a life-changing sum for virtually anyone who might have peripheral knowledge of what happened. A conversation they overheard, a detail they noticed, something someone said that didn't mean much at the time. In cases involving multiple people, financial incentive at that level almost always produces something. Someone gets nervous. Someone starts calculating what that money could mean compared to the risk of staying quiet. Someone talks. Here, no credible tip emerged that broke the case open, and that silence, layered on top of all the other silences, carried its own implications. Dr. Brucato raised a possibility that was uncomfortable, but consistent with the evidence. What if the people with knowledge weren't staying quiet out of loyalty? What if they were staying quiet out of fear? Not of law enforcement, but of someone else involved in what happened. Because when a crime involves more than one person, there are dynamics at work that go beyond the act itself. There is a question of who holds power, who controls information, and what happens to someone who steps out of line. Sometimes the greatest threat to someone who knows too much isn't getting caught. It's what happens if the wrong person finds out they've spoken. That kind of fear doesn't dissolve in the presence of a reward. If anything, it gets stronger. And if that was operating here, it meant the situation had layers that weren't immediately visible from the outside. It meant someone within whatever group was involved held enough influence over the others to maintain silence, even in the face of 7 figures. That's not a small degree of control. That suggests someone with a significant amount of power over the people around them. Brian went back to the footage. He looked again at the man on camera. His movements, his timing, the specific way he navigated the space, and he noticed something that hadn't fully registered before. The suspect was confident, yes. Calm, yes. But there was something about the precision of his movements, or rather, the occasional absence of it, that told a slightly different story. He moved well, but he didn't move like someone who designed the plan. He moved like someone executing someone else's plan. There's a specific difference in behavior between a person who knows every detail of what they're doing because they engineered it themselves, and a person who knows what they're doing because they were told what to do. The first carries a kind of ownership. The second carries a kind of mechanical compliance. The man on camera looked more like the second, which meant that somewhere behind the visible event there might be another person entirely, someone who understood the risk, who calculated the opportunity, who had the knowledge and the motivation to set something like this into motion, and who was careful enough, or strategic enough, never to put themselves in a position where a camera could record their face. That possibility changed the shape of everything, because it meant the investigation wasn't just looking for one person. It was potentially looking for a structure, a division of roles, a hierarchy, where one person plans and another acts. And in that kind of structure, the person who never shows up on camera can be the most important person in the entire story. Dr. Brucato was deliberate in how he framed the next part of his analysis. He spoke about the statistical reality that most people who are harmed by violent crime are harmed by someone they know, or, at minimum, someone who knows them, not necessarily in a deep or intimate way. The connection doesn't have to be close to be significant. It can be someone who entered the home at some point to do work, someone who made a delivery, someone who passed through in a context so ordinary it wouldn't have registered as meaningful to anyone paying attention. But that brief access, that momentary glimpse into the layout of the home, the location of rooms, the timing of routines, that information doesn't disappear. It stays with whoever observed it, and in the wrong hands, it becomes something that can be used. The comfort level displayed on that surveillance footage wasn't the comfort of someone who had read about the property or studied it from a distance. It was the comfort of someone who had experienced it firsthand, someone who had stood in that space and absorbed its details in a way that left them prepared. That kind of familiarity is a very specific clue, and it narrows the field considerably. As Brian Entin sat with everything Dr. Brucato had laid out, the motive analysis, the behavioral reading of the footage, the statistical weight of known connections, the implications of the silence surrounding such a significant reward, one question emerged above all the others. If the person responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie was not a stranger passing through, then who exactly was within her world? Who had the access? Who had been close enough at some point to know what he would need to know to walk through that property the way the footage shows? Because those questions don't point outward into the unknown. They point inward, toward the people and relationships and interactions that made up the fabric of Nancy's daily life. And that's a much smaller circle than it might initially seem. The more that circle tightened, the more the direction of this investigation began to shift towards something that nobody involved in this case wanted to consider too directly. Not a random act, not an opportunistic crime, something deliberate, something rooted in prior knowledge, something that may have begun forming long before the cameras ever caught a single frame. If this case matters to you, if you believe Nancy Guthrie deserves the kind of attention that doesn't fade when the news cycle moves on, then please like this video and subscribe to Keith's Crime Files. Every like, every subscription tells this platform that stories like this one matter. By the time Brian Entin had finished processing everything Dr. Gary Brucato had laid out, the motive analysis, the behavioral profile, the statistical weight of known victim crimes, the case of Nancy Guthrie had already moved well beyond anything that could be explained with a simple answer. What started as a disappearance from a quiet home in Horseshoe Bay, Texas, had become something more layered, more unsettling, and more resistant to easy resolution than almost anyone had anticipated. Every new detail that surfaced didn't bring clarity, it brought complexity. Every question that found an answer seemed to carry two more behind it, each one heavier than the last. And for Brian, that was the part that stayed with him longest, because he had covered enough cases to understand the usual rhythm of an investigation. In most stories, there is a point where the noise begins to settle, the irrelevant details fall away, the important ones rise to the surface. You start to see direction, a shape forming inside the chaos, a path that leads somewhere meaningful. But in this case, that shape kept shifting, not dramatically, not in some wild or unpredictable way, just enough to keep the full picture slightly out of focus, slightly beyond the reach of anyone trying to hold it still. That kind of persistent uncertainty doesn't happen without a reason, and the reason, according to Dr. Brucato, was that something fundamental was still missing. Not necessarily a piece of physical evidence, not a document or a fingerprint that had been overlooked, but something deeper than that, a piece of understanding, a framework that would allow everything else to fall into its proper place. He had talked about this idea before, the concept that once the true underlying premise of a crime is understood, Everything that seemed strange stops being strange. The contradictions resolve. The details that didn't fit suddenly belong exactly where they are. The fog lifts, but until that premise is found, the case remains scattered, and that's precisely where things stood. Brian made a decision at that point. He stopped asking the question that had been driving most of the early analysis: what happened? And replaced it with something that required a completely different kind of thinking. What would make this make sense? Not what seemed possible, not what felt likely based on initial impressions, but what single explanation, if it turned out to be true, would connect every piece of the puzzle without forcing any of them into positions where they didn't naturally belong. That shift changed the trajectory of his thinking entirely. One of the first things that came back into focus was the choice of victim. It sounds like a straightforward observation, but the deeper he examined it, the more it mattered. Why Nancy Guthrie? If the motivation behind this crime was purely financial, if someone was looking for money or assets they could extract through force, then targeting an 84-year-old woman living in a community like Horseshoe Bay carried an enormous amount of risk relative to the potential reward. There were simpler paths, targets that would not have generated the level of law enforcement response and public scrutiny that Nancy's disappearance immediately triggered. Anyone with even a basic understanding of how cases like this unfold would have known that the moment Nancy went missing, every resource available would be directed toward finding her. The spotlight would be immediate, intense, and unrelenting. And yet, whoever was responsible chose her anyway. That fact carried weight because it suggested that the decision wasn't born from convenience or random opportunity. It was specific. There was something about Nancy in particular, her circumstances, her environment, her connection to someone, that made her the target despite the enormous risk involved. And when a target is chosen in spite of danger, rather than because of ease, the reason behind that choice tends to be personal. It tends to be rooted in something that already existed between the victim and the person responsible, even if that connection wasn't visible to anyone on the outside. Dr. Brucato had been circling this idea from the beginning. The statistical probability that violent crimes are committed by someone known to the victim. The behavioral indicators on the surveillance footage that pointed toward prior familiarity with the property. The calm, unhurried movement of the suspect that didn't match the profile of a stranger encountering an environment for the first time. All of it had been building in one direction. But now, in this phase of the analysis, the idea wasn't just a statistical likelihood anymore. It was becoming the only framework that allowed the rest of the evidence to cohere. And if the suspect was someone who had crossed paths with Nancy at some point, someone who had stood inside that home, observed its layout, absorbed the details of her daily patterns, then the question of how far outward to look became a question of how far inward to focus. Not strangers from distant places, not criminal networks operating from outside the region. Someone local, someone within the fabric of everyday life in that community, close enough to have had access, observant enough to have turned that access into knowledge, and motivated by something that may never have been visible to anyone else. That narrowing brought with it a different kind of discomfort, because when the circle tightens around a victim's own world, the implications become harder to sit with. It means someone she may have trusted, or at least tolerated, or at minimum encountered without alarm, was capable of something no one around her would have predicted. And it means the danger wasn't something that arrived from the outside. It was something that had been present, possibly for a long time, without anyone recognizing it for what it was. Brian kept returning to the footage, not because he expected to see something new in the images themselves, but because the behavior captured on camera continued to be one of the most revealing elements of the entire case. The man moved with confidence, yes. That had been established early, but there was something else in his movement, a quality that became more noticeable the more Brian studied it. The suspect was comfortable, but he wasn't flawless. His actions carried a certain rhythm, but that rhythm occasionally broke. Small moments where the precision slipped, where a decision seemed slightly delayed, or a movement didn't carry the same certainty as the ones before it. Those micro-inconsistencies mattered enormously, because they pointed towards something Dr. Brucato had been building toward throughout his analysis. The suspect didn't look like the architect of this plan. He looked like someone carrying it out. There is a meaningful difference between a person who has designed every step of an operation and a person who has been given instructions and is following them in real time. The first moves with total ownership of the process. The second moves with competence, but occasionally reveals the seams, the tiny hesitations, the fractional delays, the places where memorized instructions meet unpredictable reality and don't perfectly align. If that reading was correct, and the behavioral evidence supported it, then the person on that surveillance footage might not have been the most important figure in the entire sequence of events. He might have been the visible hand, the one who accepted the physical risk of entering the home and carrying out the actions. But behind him, unseen and undocumented by any camera, there might have been someone else, someone who understood the full scope of what was happening, someone who had the knowledge, the access, and the motivation to set this in motion, someone who calculated the risks and determined that those risks were worth taking, not for themselves directly, but through someone else. That possibility restructured the entire framework of the case, because if this was a crime with divided roles, one person planning, another executing, and possibly others participating in smaller, supporting capacities, then the inconsistencies that had been so difficult to explain began to make a different kind of sense. Different people bring different levels of composure, different thresholds for pressure, different ways of processing the reality of what they are involved in. When those differences overlap inside a single event, the result can look contradictory from the outside. Moments of control next to moments of error. Confidence followed by carelessness. A plan that looks tight in its early stages and then loses structure as it progresses. Those aren't signs of a flawed individual. They can be signs of a fractured group. And within that group, the person at the center, the one whose idea this was, whose motivation fueled the entire operation, tends to leave a very specific kind of imprint, not on the physical scene itself, but on the structure of how events unfolded, the priorities that were embedded in the plan, the choices that were made about timing, location, and approach. Those elements carry the fingerprint of the mind that shaped them, even if that mind was never physically present at the scene. Brian started looking at the aftermath with that lens, because no matter how disciplined a group tries to be after committing a crime, the period that follows is always the most vulnerable. Plans account for the act itself. They rarely account for the psychological weight of what comes after, and that weight distributes unevenly across the people involved. Some absorb it, some compartmentalize, but others begin to fracture under it, in ways that eventually become visible to the people around them. Behavioral changes after a crime are among the most reliable indicators investigators look for when traditional evidence reaches its limits. A person who suddenly becomes more withdrawn than usual, someone whose daily routine shifts without explanation, a reaction to the case being discussed that carries an intensity disproportionate to what a bystander would naturally feel, spending patterns that change, relationships that strain or dissolve under pressure that no one else can see. Individually, none of these things constitute proof, but collectively, over time, they begin to form a behavioral portrait that investigators can compare against the existing evidence. And in a case where multiple people may be involved, those behavioral cracks don't just appear in one person. They appear across the group because the pressure isn't distributed equally. The person who holds the most responsibility often carries it with the most discipline, but the people beneath them, the ones who acted on instruction, the ones who participated without fully understanding the scope of what they were part of, those individuals tend to be the first to show signs of strain. They are the most likely to slip, the most likely to say something they shouldn't, the most likely to behave in a way that draws the attention of someone observant enough to notice. That's where the public becomes essential, not in a general sense, not as a crowd watching from a distance, but as individual human beings who exist within the same spaces as the people responsible, someone who works alongside them, someone who shares a neighborhood with them, someone who interacts with them in the ordinary, unremarkable contexts of daily life, and has the ability to notice when something feels different. Because human beings are remarkably sensitive to shifts in the people around them, even when they can't articulate exactly what has changed. A feeling that someone is off, a sense that a reaction didn't match the moment, a memory that connects to something seen on the news without fully clicking into place. Dr. Brucato emphasized this point with particular clarity. If the suspect was local, and everything about the evidence suggested he was, then he existed within an observable radius. He had been seen before, not necessarily in the context of the crime, but in the context of ordinary life, and the way he moved, the way he carried himself, the physical mannerisms that are unique to every individual. Those things are extraordinarily difficult to disguise. A person can change their clothing, they can alter their appearance, but their gait, the way they shift their weight, the rhythm of their stride, the posture they carry without thinking about it, those are deeply embedded patterns that remain consistent across contexts. And for someone who knows that person, even slightly, even from a peripheral interaction, those patterns can be enough to trigger recognition. That recognition might not arrive as a certainty. It might begin as something quieter, a hesitation, a nagging sense of familiarity, a thought that surfaces and then retreats before it fully forms. But that initial flicker is where breakthroughs begin. And in a case where over $1 million in reward money had failed to produce a decisive lead, the answer might not come from someone chasing the money. It might come from someone who simply couldn't shake the feeling that they had seen that walk before. Brian had heard investigators express this belief, that someone, somewhere, had already seen the footage and felt something stir. Maybe they dismissed it. Maybe they told themselves it was nothing. Maybe they didn't want to believe that someone they recognized could be connected to something this severe. That kind of internal resistance is natural. The mind protects itself from conclusions it doesn't want to reach, but the feeling doesn't disappear. It stays, quietly, waiting for the moment when it becomes impossible to ignore. The silence surrounding this case was one of its most defining features, and it was also one of its most revealing. Because the kind of silence that persists in the face of a reward this substantial, in a case this public, with this much investigative pressure, is not ordinary silence. It is maintained silence. It is silence that requires effort, that demands something from the people holding it in place, and that effort, over time, becomes harder to sustain. Dr. Brucato had been direct about what that kind of silence typically indicates. When the people who possess knowledge of a crime do not come forward despite massive financial incentive, it usually means their silence is being enforced by something more powerful than the promise of money. Fear, not the abstract fear of legal consequences, but the specific personal fear of what will happen to them if they speak. Fear of the person above them, in whatever structure enabled the crime. Fear that the individual who orchestrated everything has the ability and the willingness to ensure that anyone who breaks ranks faces consequences far more immediate and far more personal than anything the justice system might impose. That kind of control doesn't dissolve on its own, but it does erode, because the same pressure that keeps people silent also builds inside them. It accumulates in the body, in the mind, in the quiet hours when they are alone with what they know. And eventually, for most people, there comes a point where the weight of carrying that knowledge becomes heavier than the fear of releasing it. That tipping point doesn't arrive on a schedule. It can't be predicted with precision, but it is, in the experience of forensic psychologists and investigators alike, almost inevitable. Time works in two directions in cases like this. On the surface, it can make a case feel colder, more distant, more likely to slip into the category of unsolved mysteries that the public eventually stops asking about. But beneath that surface, time does something else entirely. It applies pressure to the people involved in ways that compound rather than diminish. Every day that passes without resolution is another day that the people responsible have to live with what they've done. Another day where they have to maintain the appearance of normalcy, while carrying something that is fundamentally incompatible with normalcy. Another day where a single mistake, a single unguarded moment, a single conversation that goes slightly wrong could unravel everything they've tried to keep contained. Brian understood that dynamic. He had watched it play out in other cases. Situations where the breakthrough came not from a dramatic discovery, but from the slow, steady erosion of someone's ability to keep holding on. A comment made to the wrong person, a change in behavior noticed by someone close, a moment of vulnerability that opened a crack just wide enough for the truth to begin seeping through. And he believed, based on everything he had seen and everything Dr. Brucato had laid out, that this case was moving in that direction, not quickly, not with the kind of momentum that produces headlines, but moving nonetheless, because the patterns that Dr. Brucato had identified, the familiarity of the suspect, the likelihood of a local connection, the structural indicators of multiple participants, the behavioral evidence of a plan that didn't fully succeed, all of those patterns pointed in a consistent direction. And when patterns converge rather than scatter, they are usually pointing towards something real. The suspect was not random. That conclusion had solidified beyond reasonable doubt in the minds of those who had studied the evidence most carefully. The comfort displayed on camera, the knowledge of the environment, the selection of this particular victim, despite the enormous risk. None of it aligned with a stranger acting on impulse. This was someone embedded in the world around Nancy Guthrie, someone who had gathered information through proximity and exposure, someone whose connection to her life may have seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it never registered as a potential threat. And beneath the visible suspect, beneath the man captured on camera, there was growing reason to believe that another presence existed, someone whose influence shaped the crime, but whose physical involvement was carefully minimized, someone who understood that the greatest safety lies not in executing the act, but in designing it from a position where direct exposure is avoided entirely. That individual, if they existed, would be the key to understanding not just what happened that night, but everything that led to it, every decision, every justification, every quiet moment where the idea took root and grew into something that could no longer be contained. The case had not gone cold, it had gone deep. And the difference between those two things is everything. A cold case is one where the trail has ended, where the leads have dried up, where there is nothing left to follow. A deep case is one where the evidence exists, but hasn't yet been assembled in the right configuration, where the pieces are present, but the connections between them haven't been fully drawn, where the answer is not absent, but rather waiting for the right moment, the right observation, the right person to recognize what has been in front of them all along. Brian Entin knew that moment would come, not because of optimism, but because of pattern recognition. He had seen too many cases follow this exact trajectory. The long period of frustration, the sense that resolution was impossible, and then the single, often quiet event that changed everything. A tip that finally held substance, a behavioral shift that someone finally reported, a detail that had always been there but was suddenly seen in a new light. The truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie was not locked away in some unreachable place. It existed within a radius small enough to feel personal, carried by people who returned to their daily lives and tried to behave as though nothing had changed. But something had changed, and that change, no matter how carefully managed, no matter how tightly controlled, leaves traces that time does not erase. It leaves them in the way people move through their days, in the words they choose and the ones they avoid, in the reactions they can't quite calibrate correctly, in the weight they carry that has no visible source. Somewhere within that weight is the answer to every question this case has generated, and somewhere within the community of people who cross paths with those responsible, at a store, on a street, in a conversation that seems like nothing is. The person who will eventually connect what they've observed to what they've seen on the news and realize that what they know matters more than they thought. That moment hasn't arrived yet, but the conditions that produce it are already in place. The pressure is building, the silence is straining, and the truth, as it always does in cases, shaped by human behavior rather than perfect concealment, is working its way toward the surface. It may not come as a sudden revelation. It may come as a gradual one, a slow shift from confusion to clarity, from scattered fragments to a coherent story. And when it arrives, it will carry with it the feeling not of surprise, but of inevitability, the sense that this was always where the evidence was pointing, that the answer was never truly hidden. It was simply waiting to be seen for what it was. Until that day, the story of Nancy Guthrie remains open, unfinished, carrying the weight of everything that hasn't been answered, but also carrying something else. The quiet certainty that answers do exist, that they are closer than they appear, that someone, somewhere, holds the key without yet realizing it, and when the silence finally breaks, when it does, everything will change. If you've stayed with this story from the beginning, you understand why it matters. Nancy Guthrie deserves more than silence. She deserves the kind of attention that doesn't expire, and the kind of pursuit that doesn't stop, because the story gets difficult. If you believe that too, subscribe to Keith's Crime Files and hit the like button on this video. Share it with someone who needs to see it, because the person who finally connects the last piece of this puzzle might be watching right now, and that single moment of recognition could be the one that changes everything.